Welcome to the Dirt on Growing, where we don't just plant seeds, we plant ideas that challenge the norm. I'm your host, Brandon Rust from FulCrop Sciences, and this is the podcast where living soil meets real science. From worm castings to bottled nutrients, microbial inoculants, and chemical pesticides, we're here to question the trends, break down the data, and empower your grow. It's time to think deeper and grow better.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Dirt on Growing podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about how to diagnose and fix purple stems fast with basically these three things that you really need to know. This is one of the most common symptoms that I see people reach out is purple streaking or purple stalks, purple on their leaf petioles, and it's very, very common, and there's a couple of reasons why you might potentially see this, and there are a couple of different ways that you can fix this issue. Now, oftentimes people think that this is genetic, and I have heard it from so many people, oh, this is genetic, it's genetic, it's genetic. I have never come across a plant personally that I could not fix with proper nutrient balance and proper environment. So the whole thing about purple in your stalks and your plants being genetic, I can understand that if your inflorescence is purple, your flowers are purple, genetics. But when we're talking about the actual stalks, the stems, the leaf petioles, if they are purple, it is an indication, in my opinion, a clear indication that there is something off in your garden. So the first thing that I want to talk about is cation balance. So if you don't know what a cation means, it is just a positively charged nutrient molecule. Now, you have four base cations. You have calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. Okay, these are your base cations. And the reason why they are considered your base cations is because they are uptaken in the highest quantities. Most of your nutrients are cations. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, base cations. Then you have iron, manganese, copper, zinc. Those are also cations. And then you also have ammonium, which is cationic. The only nutrients that are anions or that have a negative charge are phosphate, nitrate, sulfate, molybdenum, and boron. Chloride is also an anion, but it's used in such small quantities. Now, let's talk about these base cations, guys. If these base cations, I should also mention, are also electrolytes. And so when we're talking about what an electrolyte is, it is a nutrient ion that moves via mass flow. So these nutrient ions, they are transported via mass flow or water. So they are transported through the roots, through water, and they are moved with the movement of water through the transpiration mechanisms the plants naturally employ. And that water, those nutrients follow the path of water as it evaporates out of the plant stomata. Now, mass flow is really important because any type of nutrients that are solutes or that are soluble or held in an available form in the water will be uptaken through that water. However, that is not the only mode of uptake the plants employ. They also use diffusion and root inception. And we'll talk about diffusion on the third part when we get into phosphorus. When those base cations are not in balance, it should the majority of the ppm of the solution of your base cations should be calcium, then followed by potassium and then magnesium. You want sodium always low, but if there is an imbalance between those base cations, it can express itself as purple streaking. So you need to have a good balance. If you're doing a soil test, if you're using Logan Labs and you're doing saturated paste testing, you're shooting for about 200 ppm of calcium, 32 to 40 ppm of magnesium, and 100 to 150 ppm of potassium. Okay. Now, because these move with mass flow, they move with plant transpiration. Anything at all that can potentially limit the movement of water will not only limit, it will also limit those electrolytes, those nutrient ions, those base cations. So they not only need to be balanced, but they also need to be mobile. So we're talking about, let's say you have low vapor pressure deficit, right? Low VPD, you have too much humidity in the air, which is making it harder for the water to move out of the plant stomata, right? Because the way that water moves, it moves through diffusion. So if you have a lot of water already in the air, you can think of it as a parking spot. Let's say if all of your parking spots are already filled, there's nowhere for that water to go, right? So the water that's in the plant can't make it to the outside of the plant if there's too much humidity. It can't transpire or move that water and those solutes, those nutrients, those soluble nutrients. So if you have too high of a VPD and the atmosphere is too dry and maybe too hot, what'll happen is the plant will move water faster than the actual nutrients can solubilize and fall into solution. And then also what happens is that water becomes harder for the plant to take up as that pool decreases, because as that pool of water decreases, the concentration of the nutrients that are in there increases. So what happens is, let's say your ppm is 800 at this much water volume. Once that water volume goes down, that ppm starts to go up. That EC of that water starts to increase as the size or the amount of available water decreases, right? So that causes nutrient interactions in solution. So you could have things precipitate and become unavailable. You could have calcium tie up with phosphorus. You could have calcium tie up with sulfate. You could have magnesium tie up with sulfate. You could have magnesium tie up with phosphate. At a low pH range, you could have phosphorus tie up any of the cationic micronutrients and precipitate out of solution and become unavailable, right? But also what's happening is that water volume decreases, and as that nutrient volume and that EC spikes, you're causing osmotic stress, right? Because what's happening is all of the things that are in and around that water. Let's take like microbial membranes, for instance, right? They work through diffusion. So if they're present near that water and they're taking up those nutrients and that's super high, the cell can't process all that. It's too high and it starts to disrupt actual cellular processes and sometimes can even lyse and destroy those cell walls. That's a little bit different from the uptake. But any circumstance where you limit water movement, you're going to limit the movement of calcium, magnesium, and potassium, right? And that is one of the main factors why I personally see those streakings and those purple stems. That's not always the biggest thing. The second largest thing that I see is light intensity, right? Typically under LED lights, and it's because the use efficiency of that light is much greater. The U moles per area is much more intense, and they're running cooler, right? So oftentimes what happens is, at first, people were saying you needed to have the LEDs closer to the canopy, right? And that was because you needed to get that heat up. But when you have something that close to the canopy, the PPFD is too high and it's causing stress, right? It's causing light stress on the plants. So to be able to mitigate that issue, you have to bring the light up so it's not as high as PPFD, or dim that light to a level to where it's not too high at that canopy. I always run them a little higher than most people. And then what I do is I increase the ambient temperature to make up for the cooler temperatures from those LEDs. But that high intense PPFD and that high DLI is often another cause of that streaking. And what'll happen is you'll start seeing streaking, and it'll usually be at the top part, right? And you'll also see the production of anthocyanin because the plant is naturally trying to prevent oxidative stress from too much light. Because what's happening is with all that light, it can't be processed, and what's happening is as electrons are going loose, these things are basically creating oxidative compounds that are oxidizing the internal parts of the cells of the plant, and it's ripping these things apart, right? And the plant can't produce enough of these antioxidants, right? It has to produce antioxidants. That is what anthocyanin is, or that purple pigment. It's a flavonoid, but it's also an antioxidant. And what's happening is it's basically putting on natural sunblock. It's producing its own sunscreen to prevent that oxidative stress from that high intensity light. And then, so that's another thing. And light, right? And mass flow of water, there's a correlation between these two. And I'm going to tie these things together because your VPD should be taken, and what should be taken into consideration is the temperature of the actual canopy itself, right? So if you're taking a laser thermometer and you're looking at the temperature, that's what you should be. If you have really low temperatures on your leaf canopy or they're too high, it's going to affect transpiration rate. And a lot of times your light is responsible for how hot that canopy gets, right? So if your canopy is too hot, you can bring your light up. But if it's not hot enough, you can increase the ambient temperature in your environment to supplement that heat. So that's another way that you can fix the purpling stems. Okay, so the first one is cation balance. So base cation balance and make sure that your environmental parameters are on point. So that way you have proper transpiration. The second is light management. Okay. And then the third is going to be phosphorus. So phosphorus deficiency or any type of conditions that can limit the movement of phosphorus. Okay. And phosphorus doesn't move via mass flow like the electrolytes. Okay. It moves through diffusion. So diffusion is like if you take a glass of water and you take food coloring and you drop it into that glass slowly over time, the entropy, it's called entropy, which is basically chaos, right? All things fall into chaos. All things have entropy, right? Everything wants to be at the least energy state or at the state of rest, okay? And so what happens is that coloring, you can see it when it first comes in, where it's just in one part, but it starts to diffuse or it spreads out all of its molecules over the entire substance. And that's how diffusion works. So if you have, let's say, a root right here, let's say you have a root and there's a higher concentration gradient of phosphorus on the outside of that root, then that phosphorus will move into that root or into that cell. So it works just like that food coloring. You can think of it diffusing into the lower concentration gradients. That's how diffusion works with phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is tricky though, because plant available phosphate is different than phosphorus, because most phosphorus exists as unavailable forms, especially in soils, right? It has to be metabolically converted through either mineral weathering or microbial metabolism into phosphate, the plant anion. Now, it's tricky because if you have too much calcium or too much magnesium, it can interact with that phosphorus and can cause those precipitation reactions and limit phosphorus availability. This also can happen in lower pH ranges with a wide variety of micronutrients and aluminum. Okay, so what ends up happening is any type of nutrient interaction that can limit the availability of phosphorus can cause that purple streaking, because what happens is Once the phosphorus slows down, sugars start to build up in the plant, and there's no energy for the plant to catabolize those sugars for energy or move those sugars into other parts of the plant where they're needed to be converted into other complex carbon chemicals. So 1 is your base cations, okay? 2 is going to be light, and 3 is going to be phosphorus. So remember diffusion, right? If you're not getting proper cycling, you can always use a microbial process that will help cycle that phosphorus. All of those things all interact together, though. You have to look at it as a system, as a holistic system, right? The different types of transport mechanisms. When we're talking about this, we're talking about mass flow and diffusion. When we're talking about light intensity and the amount of heat at the canopy that affects transpiration, and then all of the nutrient dynamics that function together with all those different nutrients. So that is my rant. That was a fucking ton of information crammed into 16 minutes. I'm going to open this up for the next 10 minutes for Q&A. Make sure you guys follow, make sure you guys like, subscribe, all that stuff that you're supposed to do. And remember, right now with $100 orders on the website, we're giving away free Starfighter Cross 2 Miracle Alien Cookie. Originally bred by Capulator. It is F2's of his work. I did selections over the past year, either on the Seed Vault website or on the Bokashi Earthworks website. Make sure that you comment you want seeds at checkout, but I'm usually just throwing them in there with large orders anyway. All right, so we have our first question from Sword Wielder. What is your ideal temperature for canopy leaf temperature? So the ideal temperature, in my opinion, is between 78 and 82 degrees in vegetative. In generative or in flowering, it usually stays out there for the first couple of weeks, and then you may want to start decreasing it, especially as you get late into flowering. I like to bring my canopy temperature down into about the 72 to 74 range, especially the last couple of weeks, to help preserve the volatilization of terpenes. So my ramp schedule, I ramp up through the cycle with my light intensity, and then I ramp back down towards the end. And the same thing with that leaf temperature as well. It's very similar to that curve where we ramp up a little bit and then we ramp down. We're not typically going over 84 degrees leaf surface temperature at any phase of growth. Purple stems are genetic, bro, says every Athena rep. I don't know too many Athena reps. Trent's got a garden. He's got a question right here. Do you recommend turning LED lights down to a level in veg since most LEDs are too intense? I do. So I have I'm running 640 watt LEDs in my flowering room, and I currently have them at 65%. But typically, they're not going, you probably won't have to run it more than 50% of 640 watts. As long as you have a light that's big enough to cover the entire area, you don't need that massive, massive amount of light. And oftentimes, light is a big factor on why things are going wrong. People pushing light too much and too hard are oftentimes the root cause of a lot of what they're seeing. They think it's a deficiency symptom sometimes, or sometimes they see it as toxicity. They don't understand what's going on, but oftentimes just lowering the light intensity will have positive benefits. Do you stop using the Microbe Plus towards the end of flowering? I do. I'm typically not feeding anything the last couple of weeks in my living soil systems, but if I'm doing cocoa or an inert media, I'll use it probably until the last week or so, or until I feel if my plant. It really depends on how I feel about that plant, that bed? How are they looking? Do I feel like they're going to need more? But typically I'm not feeding late. I let things ramp down so that way there's not a bunch of nutrients built up in the plant. If you are having problems and you switch from HPS to LED, I recommend dimming the light and increasing your temperature. If you're going to increase your temperature, you also have to increase your relative humidity. That's the biggest trick with LEDs. Question: how does ammonium fit into the picture of cation balance between calcium, magnesium, and potassium? Yeah, absolutely. Because it is another cation, it does have a relationship with those base cations. So again, it's all about balance, making sure you have enough of each of them without overabundance, because overabundance of one of them will slightly, even if it's like, okay, so let's say you're just slightly abundant on potassium, right? Well, that slight abundance might mean that you are sufficient on magnesium, but now you're getting just you're just under the amount that you need to be getting. And so over the course of, let's say, 2 weeks, you start seeing these purpling streaks and all these things start to develop, but it's all about balance, right? Having a right amount. And here's the thing: when it comes to ammonium, typically we're not feeding high ammonium inputs, right? Ammonia inputs. And the reason why is because they like the nitrate better. And the reason why they like the nitrate better is because the nitrate has a negative charge. And when your plant is always taking up positive cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, iron, zinc, manganese, copper, all of those things are positive. It's like a battery. You can only put so much charge into it before you either put something negative into it to neutralize some of that charge, or before that plant needs to discharge positive cations. In what the plant will do is it'll discharge sodium or potassium ions to take up more cations that it might need, like magnesium or more iron, right? But if it's taking up nitrate has a negative charge, and so it can help balance that internal charge balance of the plant. All right, I gotta get going, guys. I know. Make sure you guys go tap in. I'm gonna save this so you guys can rewatch it. My dog's going crazy. I think he's got to go take a dookie. Go tap in BokashiEarthworks.net and the Bokashi Seed Vault website. Freebies of the Starfighter Cross to Mac 1 while supplies last, but I have about 200 packs, so they're not going anywhere for a while. Make sure you leave a comment at checkout. I'll see you guys soon.